Hello, this is Mark from My Keys to Music. Thanks for joining me on this video. Today we're talking about the artist Steve Winwood, and the name of the song is called Valerie. What's particularly interesting about this song is the solo. And what's interesting about the solo is the fact that you really have to play the pitch bend and the mod wheel quite a bit to pull it off. At least that's my interpretation of it. Check it out. So for this sound, we are going to be using a Nordwave 2, but if you don't have a Nordwave 2 and you have a Nord Stage 3 or any other keyboard for that matter, anything that can produce a basic analog waveform, you should be able to come up with something close for this sound and for this solo. You'll hear me say in so many videos we start with a saw wave or maybe a square wave, lots of times even a sine wave. But in this particular circumstance, we're going to be using a pulse waveform, 10, which stands for 10%. You can see here by this very thin line where you see this would be a square wave, also known as 50%, where this line moves back and forth based on the waveform shape. But this is pulse 10. That's what we're going to start with. And listen to that in its raw form. It's almost the same kind of sound you'd hear like on a buzzer. It's a very thin, buzzy sound. But for this particular solo, it fits the bill. Now, what I found interesting when I did a little research on the pulse wave here on Wikipedia, they explain the pulse wave and how it works, and they talk about it as it relates to sound. And then down here, there's a subsection called Applications, and it says, acoustically, the rectangular wave has been described variously as having a narrow, thin, nasal, buzzy, biting, clear, resonant, rich, round, and bright sound. Pulse waves are used in many Steve Winwood songs, such as While You See a Chance. How about that? After I read that, it validated that we were definitely using the right waveform. Now, in addition to the waveform, what I also have been doing is I've been putting the unison on 1. This will, in a sense, double or triple the waveform, and then bring another virtual waveform just like it, but slightly detuned. And then there's also a widening of it. You'll hear, if you're listening in headphones, the difference between no unison and unison 1. It almost feels like the sound gets wider because there's more of a phase happening because of that doubling and that detuning that's happening. Now, you'll notice that a big part of what makes this solo is the fact that the pitch bend is being used so frequently and the modulation wheel. Now, the only reason I'm using the modulation wheel is because that's where I'm introducing vibrato. But on this keyboard and perhaps many others, you don't necessarily have to use the wheel to introduce the vibrato. You could use aftertouch to introduce the vibrato, which I'm now going to demonstrate. As I push a key, and then lean into that key by pushing harder, it'll introduce aftertouch and the vibrato. So if you did that, that gives you the option of having your wheel free for some other control. And if you listen very closely to the original solo, you'll hear, in fact, if you're not looking for it, you won't hear, but if you're looking for it and listening for it, you'll hear that the first part of that solo starts very bright, very buzzy, with all the frequencies being let through, or most of them at least. Then as the solo progresses, somewhere around the second phrase or the third phrase, you'll hear the frequencies sort of diminish a bit, almost as if someone was closing the filter, and it's a lot more subdued by the time the end of the solo comes in. And I didn't realize that until listening to it for several times. I wasn't listening for that, but then I realized, yeah, something isn't right about this, because I was trying to determine how much filter I should use for the whole sound. And sometimes I'd hear it and I'd say, wow, it needs to be more filter. And then sometimes I'd hear it, well, I need to take some of the filter out. That's because it's changing. Now, one possibility is the fact that that filter might have been going through an LFO on the original recording, and they set it for a very slow rate so that it started bright and then it backed off as the solo progressed. It never really goes down too much, but it does back off. So I think instead of trying to set the LFO here and trying to time it correctly, I'm just using the wheel, and I'm going to set the wheel to adjust the filter. With that said, I'm going to turn the filter on, and we'll bring those frequencies down just a little bit to the part where you'd hear in the last half of the solo. Somewhere around there. Maybe a little bit more. There we go. I'm going to settle right about there. So now, if I put the wheel forward, it's going to be brighter. So I can start my solo with the wheel maybe 3/4. And then as the solo progresses, I can back off on the wheel. Now that's another approach. You saw me play, in the early part of the video here, you saw me use the wheel to actually adjust the vibrato. But I will now just use Aftertouch for the vibrato when I play this through now. In addition, we will put on the reverb here. I'll put a stage with the dry-wet setting somewhere in the middle. That sounds good. Optionally, you can turn on mono or legato. Mono mode will kind of give it the opportunity where you're not going to be able to play but only one note at a time. And additionally, you can have some fun and introduce some glide. I wouldn't put any more than a 0.1 glide rate. That'll give it more of that sticky sliding sound. And you can potentially use that if you haven't quite mustered the coordination to do all the bends. You can use, more of the glide to kind of band-aid it. See how it kind of mimics the sliding, but it isn't really as good as using the actual. All right, what else is going on? I think that's pretty much it. That pretty much takes care of it. So you've got the pulse width 10. You've got a little bit of the frequency taken out, especially towards the end, the middle and the end of the solo. Basic reverb. You can add some EQ. I thought that you could brighten it up a little bit on the EQ. That's flat. That's a little brighter. The bass probably doesn't matter because we're playing on the high end, so I'll just leave that where it is. Yeah, it's not making a difference. And then as I back off, all right, let's play it through the whole way, and we'll make those adjustments. And that's how you do the Steve Winwood Valerie solo on a keyboard. I hope you enjoyed it.